NATO announced today it will deploy Patriot anti-missile systems along the Turkish border. The move is designed to fortify defenses against cross-border attacks from Syria, but it could also be sending a message in light of concerns that the Syrian government forces could be preparing to use chemical weapons. Will it draw allies in the military alliance, including Canada, of course, into that conflict? And how could the escalating situation unfold across the region? Meantime, we're watching Syria, but also the more violent protests in Egypt, a very tense situation there tonight as the violent protests against President Morsi and his constitutional powers continue. Let's get a reading on that. Janice Stein is in Toronto. She joins me now, director of the Munk School of Global Affairs in the University of Toronto, just back from Egypt as well. And Cliff May, the president of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, he joins us from Washington. Good to see both of you. Janice, let's start on the Syria-Turkey border. How significant is NATO's move to finally deploy these Patriot missiles along the Turkish border? What's at stake here?
Well, the Turks have been asking for this really for several months, Evans. So it is, I think, a very significant move by NATO. Really what it's saying to the Turks, who feel very exposed because there are Syrian strikes against forces that are deployed just over the frontier. Shrapnel flies, hits Turkish villages. So the fact that NATO is sending a signal to Turkey, first of all, you are one of us, which is not the way Europe has been speaking to Turkey over the last 5 years. That's important. 2, we are going to fulfill our obligations to you. And 3, a signal to Syria. Watch out. We are, in fact, going to honor our obligations to Turkey for collective self-defense.
All right. Cliff, what do you make of this? The Office of Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs sent us a statement on the NATO move to help defend Turkey's border with Syria, and I'll just read it to you. Canada, along with its allies, supported this request made by Turkey. Canada calls for calm and for the Assad regime to stop drawing in neighboring countries to this self-inflicted violent struggle to hold on to power. That's from Rick Roth, the spokesman for the Foreign Affairs. Minister Baird's office also said that Canada is asking Russia and China to use their leverage to prevent this from spiraling further. I guess the question is, after what Hillary Clinton said yesterday about there are plans for a reaction if the Assad regime uses chemical weapons, what's going on here? How close is NATO coming to getting more seriously involved here?
Well, I'm not sure NATO is going to get more seriously involved, although there has to be some consideration of that. There are two separate things to consider. One is Turkey doesn't like to have missiles rain down on its people. Actually, no nation does, and Turkey should be reminded that if it doesn't like it, others of its neighbors, like Israel, doesn't like to have that happen as well. As for the chemical weapons, that's a serious war crime. I think there's real concern that Assad has these weapons, quite a lot of these chemical weapons, is in desperate straits, and may think he needs to use them to protect himself either in Damascus if he stays there, or, and this is one theory you hear, if he decides to flee to the Alawite heartlands and sort of ensconce himself there and say, don't come after me, don't come after the Alawites here. If you do, I'll use these weapons. But the use of chemical weapons obviously would escalate things a lot. And then you'd have to ask NATO, are they going to allow this? If NATO can, or the U.S. can, or Israel can destroy these chemical weapons where they are safely, should they not do so? That's a question I think that at least has to be considered.
Janice, just last thing before we move to the Egyptian situation. Canada's role here, if NATO's role gets more involved, more complicated, where does Canada and how might Canada become involved here?
There's not really right now on the table, Evan, a sense that Canada is going to become operationally involved. It's not going to commit military assets. What's on the table, frankly, is being discussed in the United States and elsewhere, is this issue of the use of chemical weapons and what forces would go in immediately where there's strong evidence that Assad was in fact preparing to use these weapons. There is growing concern, there's no question about it, but what we would see then is a very quick intervention in an effort to secure those weapons before they were used, and I don't think Canada would have a role in that.
What's a quick intervention? I mean, post-Libya, just explain. Is there any such thing once you get involved here? And we always talk about this, always easy to get in, very tough to get out.
Very tough to get out, and this is not an easy job. It's actually very concerning, Evan. There are some 40-plus sites where these chemical weapons are stored. Hezbollah has moved closer to some of these sites. So we're really talking here about some boots on the ground that would have to go in, a strike force, secure those weapons, remove or destroy what is possible, and then leave. So it's a very different kind of intervention than what we saw in Libya.
All right.
But one concern I've been hearing here, and this has been raised, is the possibility that Hezbollah, rather than Assad and his troops, Hezbollah is getting its hands on these weapons and will have them. That would be very alarming, not least to Israel. I think then you would see some kind of intervention, and it could be special forces or it could be precision weaponry, depending on the intelligence you have of their location.
Can we move to Egypt? I mean, it's hard to keep track of the number of situations right now. Very fluid situation in Egypt right now in the aftermath of the crisis over President Morsi's new constitutional powers. You were just there, Janice said. Do you think things are going to get more violent if Morsi continues to push for the referendum on the new constitution that would further cement his powers? I mean, clearly, it's hard for us to realize exactly what's happening with these protests.
You know, this is really a head-on confrontation. It's really interesting. I think what's important to remember are two things here. One, the military are in their barracks, and that's partly because the draft constitution gives the military virtually everything it wants. There's no civilian oversight of the military in this constitution. The second relevant point then is Morsi cannot control the streets of Cairo. There are over 200,000 demonstrators in the streets. There are counter demonstrations. That's a very dangerous situation that's not going to go away. And the judges have said that they will not, as they were required to do, certify the referendum. So you have parts of the deep Egyptian state now on strike against Morsi and his presidency. That's as close to all-out confrontation as you get, and it's in fact what brought Mubarak down.
Right. So how do you, Cliff, how do you read this? Are we seeing here, is this about the people wanting more democracy, or is this a direct challenge to Mr. Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood, and a kind of an attempt at a radicalization? How do you read the situation here?
I'm actually encouraged by the demonstrators in the streets. I think what they're saying is pretty clear. They do not intend to exchange autocracy, which is what they had under Mubarak, for theocracy, which is what Morsi is sort of trying to foist on them through the Muslim Brotherhood. They don't want that, and they want something else. Now, I don't know that they necessarily prevail. I think there's a role for the U.S. and for Canada and for the West here, because I don't think it's in the interest of the taxpayers in the West to be subsidizing a transition from an autocracy to a theocracy.
So what's the role there? Are you suggesting, just so people realize, I mean, the IMF just gave billions of dollars to Egypt. Some thought that helped Mr. Morsi play a more constructive role in the Hamas-Israeli situation, recognizing he's got to move to the center. And what are you saying, that it's time to cut that kind of funding?
Well, I wouldn't simply cut it, but I would establish certain goals and metrics and conditionality, I guess is the right word to use here, for further aid. Yes, I'm glad that Morsi played a constructive role, but I don't think that's a good reason to allow him to establish a dictatorship over the Egyptian people. I think that would be a very bad mistake. He doesn't want Hamas leading Egypt into a war with Israel, but that's not just because we ask him not to. I think that's also in his self-interest and the Egyptian self-interest. So I don't think we should be funding that kind of transition. He has to back down and allow some pluralism, some democracy, some representative government, some minority rights, some women's rights. All of those things have to be on the table, and he has to know it.
All right. Last word to you, Janice, on that.
Let me just say this. The Egyptians are going to make this happen one way or the other. The U.S. does not really have leverage with Morsi. Most of the U.S. aid goes to the military. It doesn't go to the civilian side. And frankly, the best thing the West can do, keep its hands off this and let the Egyptians, and it's not going to be peaceful and it may well be violent, but this is for Egyptians to decide with respect to the future of Egypt. We can only make it worse.
All right. Now, some reports, just out of interest, unconfirmed yet by CBC, but some sources reporting that Mr. Morsi has actually fled from the presidential palace in the wake of the protest. We'll be following that to try to confirm that. But you get a sense of how fluid the situation right now is in Egypt. Janice Stein, Cliff May, I appreciate your time today as always.